In this last section, we will talk about how chemical groups are fundamental for the molecular function, and this will help us to understand the diversity of molecules that we will study. To study functional groups, I recommend you to go to your textbook, and here you can see a table that you can see summarize all the functional groups. The functional groups are the sections of the molecules that are reactive. So when you see two molecules of sugar that are going to attach to each other, you will see that they will be attached using these functional groups. If you see how amino acids are going to attach to each other to form proteins, and we will study that in a few chapters, they will be by the functional groups. And these functional groups, they give unique chemical properties to those molecules. So two things to remember. First, when we talk about functional groups, so all these organic molecules, they have functional groups, and they are the ones that are most commonly involved in chemical reactions. Second thing that I wanted you to remember is that those functional groups give each molecule its unique properties. So now let's talk about each one of these functional groups in a little bit of detail. So we will talk about functional groups like the hydroxyl group, that is an OH, the carbonyl group, that is a double bond to an oxygen, a carbon and an oxygen, a carboxyl group, that you can see in addition to the double bond to the oxygen, you have an OH, the amino group, the sulfhydryl group, and the phosphate group. So let's start talking about the first functional group, that is the hydroxyl, that has this OH, and it can be written also HO, and are alcohols, and their specific names usually end up in OL. So let me show you the ethanol is an example, and the ethanol finish in OL. And in addition to having two carbons, have our hydroxyl group. And something that is very important is that in this case, the hydroxyl group is polar. And as a result, the electrons spend more time near the electronegative oxygen atom. And let me show you an example of that in the next slide, that it will be much easier. And this example will show that the hydroxyl group can form hydrogen bonds with water, and it will allow to dissolve organic compounds such as sugar. So now let's see how they are able to dissolve. So here in the ethanol, you have here the hydroxyl group, and if you see the hydrogen here is going to interact with water. So here you form the hydrogen bonds here, and the oxygen can also is looking for more hydrogens to interact. So here you are going to find another hydrogen bond. So as a result, you can dissolve this molecule in water. Let's talk about the next functional group. They are called carbonyl, and here you can see the functional group. And in the carbonyl consists of an atom, that is a carbon atom, joined by an oxygen atom that you can see here, and they are joined by a double bond, and you can see here the double bond. So let's see two examples. You can have one example that are within the carbon skeleton, and here you have another example that is at the end of this carbon skeleton, and in this case those have two different names. One are called, so let's remember the first example, it's called ketones if the carbonyl group is within the carbon skeleton, and the second one of this carbonyl group are called aldehydes if the carbonyl group is at the end of the carbon skeleton, and this is called acetone, and this is called propanol. Now let's talk about the next functional group, that is the carboxyl. And you can see here the carboxyl group, and it's formed by an oxygen, but this oxygen has a double bond with the carbon. And you also have a hydroxyl group here. So the entire assembly of this atom is called carboxyl group and can be written like this. And this is an example. Is they are called carbolic acids or organic acids. In this scale, you find the acetic acid, and here you have the carboxyl group. And these molecules will be very important to form a molecule called amino acids that are the monomers, the building blocks of proteins that we will talk in future classes. Now we're going to talk about the other part of the amino acids that are the amino group. So here you have the amino group consisted of nitrogen atom both bonded to a hydrogen bond. So here you find the nitrogen and two hydrogen. And this is an example. Here you have the amino group, nitrogen and two hydrogens, one and two hydrogens. And this glycine is an amino acid that can act as a base. And as we studied in previous lectures, they can pick up the hydrogen from its surrounding solution. So, for example, if they are in water, in an aqueous solution, this amino group can add another hydrogen, so can pick up some hydrogen. And I want that you see this glycine, and you remember, so this is the amino group. Do you remember what is the name of this functional group? This is amino, and this functional group is an organic acid. Organic acid. So when you have an organic acid and amino, you get an amino acid. And they have two components, two functional groups, and we will study this in a lot of details. All these amino acids that they will be have a lot of properties. For example, some of them are act as a base, some of them can act as an acid, and they are very important for producing all the functions in living organisms. Another functional group are the sulfhydryl, and they can be written like this. And a sulfhydryl group consists of a sulfur bonded to a hydrogen atom. And look what you see here, and look what you see here. So stop the video and think, what is this? This is an amino group, and this is a organic acid. So when you add these two, you get a amino acid. Amino acid, as we saw it in the previous slide. And here you have another functional group, that is the sulfhydryl, and this is a famous amino acid called cysteine, and is one of the amino acids that have a sulfur group that is important in the diversity of amino acids. Another functional group that it will be very important and we will study in a lot of detail is this phosphate group. And the first thing that I want that you see is that yes, they have a phosphate. Here, this is the phosphate, but they also have 4 oxygen. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. But these 4 oxygen have different bonds, and in this case, they have a hydroxyl group. So it will give very interesting properties. And remember that this is negative, very negative, very negative. So you have so many oxygens there that this molecule will be extremely negative, and it will be very important for as an energy molecule, and we will study later. This will be part of an important molecule called ATP, And this will also be important in a very famous molecule that are nucleic acids like, such as DNA and RNA. So this molecule is very interesting. These phosphate groups are very important. As I said, one oxygen is bonded to the carbon skeleton, while two oxygens carry negative charge. And as I said before, this will be very electronegative, and as a result, is very important for to carry energy. And we have here the coin for metabolism, that is the molecule of ATP. That, don't worry if you haven't heard about that, we will study that in future chapters. This is an example of another molecule that have a phosphate group, that is the glycerol phosphate. Here you have the functional group, and this one is located in many chemical reactions, and this will provide the backbone for phospholipids, and phospholipids, we will study that in future slides. They will be very important in cell membranes. And later, when you study chemistry and maybe biochemistry with Candace, you will study that this glycerol phosphate, they park in many chemical reactions in the cells. So phosphate group, very important for many molecules such as ATP, nucleic acids, and even other molecules like the glycerol phosphate. And remember, as it's so electronegative because you have so many oxygens, it will be involved in a lot of chemical reactions, in particular those involved in interchange of energy. To finish, I told you this story about the versatility of carbon to create a huge diversity of molecules, and I told you multiple times about these four bonds that the carbon can form, that these allow to have a lot of variation, and these allow this biological diversity. And in the next chapter we will talk about all these macromolecules, that they have variation in the length, in the position of the double bonds, in the branching, and in the presence of different rings. So we will talk about how nucleic acids have, like DNA, have rings. We will talk about, for example, that lipids, they have very long hydrocarbons, and some of them will be saturated and other will be unsaturated, and the difference will be in the presence of absence of these double bonds. And we will just go and talk in detail about all this diversity.